Welcome back. I'm Frank Perri, and we'll be looking at the relationship of red-collar crime to the family. In particular, we'll be looking at what happens when we have adult children who kill their mother and father, or at a minimum make attempts on their life. Now, often we read about what are referred to in this case as parricides, and they are horrific crimes. There are several risk factors that may lend a child to kill the parent or parents. One of them if there are histories of abuse. Another one if there are mental health issues, psychiatric issues. And another one is what is referred to as antisocial behaviors. Now, there are some common themes in these murders. Number one, prior to the murder, you saw evidence of family turmoil, interpersonal conflict. At times, there is prior violence. These adult children are also parasitic in nature, where they're taking advantage of their parents, both emotionally and financially. They're very exploitative and entitled. Let's look at a case involving James Soros, who killed both of his parents. In this case, James lived with his parents and was very parasitic in that he took advantage of his parents' goodwill. He was engaging in fraud. There were issues between the parents and he, and one day he took a heavy object, what appeared to be a garden tool that had a hammer on the end, and by blunt force trauma, killed both of his parents. What's interesting here is what the neighbor said about James. And the neighbor said something to the effect, quote, "He wanted more, and he wanted more, and he wanted more." What does that reflect? It reflects that malignant narcissism of entitlement. Let's move on now to the case of Christopher Porco, who killed his father and left his mother for dead. This is also a case in which Christopher was engaging in what would characterize as bank fraud, where he was in a sense forging his father's signature in order to get money. Now, in this case, the father and the mother were very loving parents, but they did confront him about this issue of engaging in financial exploitation. And the father said that he was going to file forgery affidavits. At the time, Christopher was not living at home, but he had access to the home. He was living at the University of Rochester. He went from the University of Rochester about 3 hours away to the family home. He snuck into the home, and with a large axe, he cleaved his father to death, and he did the same thing to the mother, but she lived. All right, she lived. Now, outsiders who looked and observed this case, who are forensic professionals, said that he displayed psychopathic traits. But before the homicide occurred, a little bit about Christopher in that he also engaged in theft, identity theft. He stole from employers. Moreover, he also falsified his college transcript. What do we see with Christopher? We also see an individual who engaged in what is referred to as impression management. How did he do that? Well, when he went to the hospital to visit his mother, during an interview he said, "I saw her there, and I burst out in tears and I fell to the ground." Now, why do I call that impression management? Because he's trying to create an impression of himself as the son who was distraught. But what's interesting here is that he went to the hospital with a friend, and the friend said that he was amazed that Christopher didn't display any emotion, but yet Christopher was trying to give the impression how distraught he was. What is this reflective of? If you recall when I discussed on psychopathy and how they try to recognize emotions, this was a ritualistic display, meaning he's just going through the motions to convince you that he is an innocent person. The last case that I would like to discuss with you is one involving Eric Hansen. In this case, we have a quadruple homicide where he not only killed his mother and father, but he killed his sister and brother-in-law. In this case, Eric had a history of antisocial behavior, criminality, pathological lying, taking advantage of people, especially his parents. In this case, Eric was committing identity theft of his parents, credit card fraud, bank fraud. Now, the sister, whose name was Kate, eventually confronted him about the fraud. And he lashed out, saying, "Get out of my life. Stay out of my life." And at times even threatening her well-being. Several weeks after this confrontation, Eric, who was living with his parents, went to his sister Kate's house and his brother-in-law Jimmy's house, and by blunt force trauma, killed them. Jimmy's face was unrecognizable due to the blows. Kate's arms were broken as she's trying to shield the blows to her body. He then went back to his house. His mother and father were sleeping, and he shot both of them in the head. Now, eventually he was apprehended, and the prosecutor even said that this was a classic fraud detection homicide case. It was in fact a red-collar offender who killed others to prevent the detection and or disclosure of their fraud schemes. In this case, the fraud was detected, but he was trying to prevent the disclosure. Now, prior to him being sentenced by the court for the quadruple homicide, in this case, he was evaluated by a forensic psychologist. And in fact, he was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder coupled with antisocial traits. What are we talking about here? We're talking about that malignant narcissism that I discussed with you when we looked at personality traits that act as a risk factor. I want to end this with what the remaining living sister had to say, because she was also on his list of individuals that he wanted to kill. Now, when Eric was going to be sentenced, the remaining sister had an opportunity to give what is referred to as an impact statement. And an impact statement is basically telling the court how this crime has impacted not only them individually, but others in their life. And she said this: "My parents did so much for Eric. When he was in trouble at school, my parents would meet with the school officials. When Eric was in trouble at home, they would go to counseling with him to try and help him out. When he was in trouble with the police, my parents would get him a lawyer and attend court with him. They supported him when he wanted to go to golf school, when he wanted to be a CNA, or when he was trying to work as a mortgage officer. They let him live under their roof, helping him get on his feet. Eric murdered the only people in his life that loved him unconditionally." As you can see, domestic violence has many different risk factors, but at times the ones that we don't consider is how in fact financial issues can trigger a violent response. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to these cases that are very sensitive in nature. And we'll be discussing these cases and their implications in more depth in our question and answer segment. Please stay tuned.
Frank, what do parents of these adult children not understand about them?
That's a great question. I want to try to give a partial explanation because family violence is very complicated. So I'll try to give it, at least in the context of red-collar crime, and it may be applicable in other scenarios, but just in this case. I think, first of all, what we need to acknowledge and what the facts show in these cases is that it's not as if the problems just occurred when they were adult children. If you look at their social histories, you go back, even pre-adolescent, you can see the emergence of an individual that was very antisocial, in that they would hurt people, they engaged in that lying. Now, of course, one can say that all children lie, But it came to a point where you see these traits intensify as they get older. Now, that being said, what you have here is we need to understand the concept of what turmoil means. And I've mentioned that before, and that there's turmoil in these families, especially between the adult children and the parent. What does that turmoil mean? I think in part we have to step back and ask ourselves, what does the typical parenting model look like? On balance, and it's going to be simplified, it's that you reward good behavior and that you put restrictions on bad behavior. What we have here is that model typically doesn't work with these children, either as adolescents, and as adults, it's going to be non-existent. And let me explain. When the parents in these cases, especially now in talking adult children, when they try to show that goodwill, when they show love and affection, things of those type of traits, these adult children look at that as a weakness. They look at it as a weakness to exploit, not in a sense that step back, have a little self-awareness. What am I doing wrong here in my relationship with my parents, and how can I make it better? Here are my parents going out of their way to help. In the cases that I stated in the segment on family and red-collar crime, these were very good families who went out of their way to help their adult children, not only as adults, but even when they were just minors. And they went out of their way to help them, but it didn't matter to the adult child. Conversely, when the parents tried to put restrictions on their behavior, what is the problem there? Well, at that point, you're starting to interfere with their sense of entitlement. They actually see those restrictions as a form of provocation to aggress against. In a sense, you're getting in the way of what they want. Let me give you an example of what I mean by goal interference. You come home, you see somebody's burglarizing your house, you're trying to stop them from stealing your property. You're getting in the way of what they want, which is your property, and they're willing to do what they have to neutralize you as a threat. They may harm you physically, they may even kill you. Now, take those concepts and put them in this red-collar crime context. What do you have? You have basically the parents who have the child not addressing their behaviors. The parents get frustrated. The adult child sees them as interfering with what they want. Their goodwill is not appreciated. And this is where you get that interpersonal conflict. This is where you get turmoil, where you have the goodwill, okay, and you have that goal interference, that provocation, restrictions, constantly butting heads with each other, because that parenting model simply doesn't work. And that's why you have these family dynamics that simply become almost, the way I would characterize it, as a race to the bottom, where drip, 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 at some point it explodes, and it explodes in a violent manner. Where's the problem here for the parents? At times, their child's indifference is viewed as, well, things are normal. That's not the way it should be interpreted necessarily. What's happening is during that period of calm, that's when they're actually planning one's demise. For example, in the Christopher Porco case, now I had an opportunity to get the email exchange between the parents and Christopher over many months. And you can just sense that buildup and that buildup where the parents are showing goodwill. Christopher is saying, I love you, but yet he is manipulating them financially. This is frustrating the parents. They're going to file forgery affidavits against Christopher. Christopher sees this as a form of provocation, and during this period of time, he's planning on how he's going to neutralize the threat. So this is where we have problems. A question that parents have to ask themselves in this case, and it's a difficult question, is what should they do in this position? And that is not an easy answer, because often these individuals, these adult children, live with you, meaning the parents, they live with them under the same roof. At best, at a minimum, these are some of the questions that you have to ask yourself. And keep in mind, I'm looking in the context of how do we neutralize or mitigate the risk of harm to our person? First of all, financial information that is sensitive in nature, personal codes, computer codes, blank checks, bills, things that have personal information, you're going to have to find a way to secure them, all right? Other type of assets like jewelry or other expensive items, you're going to have to secure them. And then the ultimate question is, do you going to want some of this person to live with you? And that could be a very dangerous point, because often in domestic violence cases, the worst time is when somebody tries to leave, or when somebody tries to say, I want you to leave. Why is that an issue? Because in that sense, they are losing control. And that is a very painful psychological impact on the offender, when they are losing control over the persons, or the situation. And at that point, the question becomes, do you get law enforcement involved? Do you get potential restraining orders, orders of protection? Do you change the locks and the codes? Do you get sensory equipment around your home? Now, I know that perhaps this sounds draconian in nature, but at the end of the day, you have to know that the end result can be your death. And that's a very uncomfortable place for a parent to go, and maybe one that they don't want to acknowledge. But if we're talking about it in terms of red-collar crime, that is the reality.
Are there any red flags to be looking out for in a young child?
As a child, fantastic question. These are some of the things that I've been able to find, at least in the context. Number one, if you're engaging, when you start to, especially as an adolescent, if you're engaging in that pathological lying, that is a sign. Another one is whether or not there may be signs of animal cruelty, all right? Why is that? Because typically when children engage in animal cruelty, what they're doing is that they're learning on how to control a living object. And an animal, of course, a cat or a dog, for example, is not going to be able to fight back in the way that an adult might, but it's teaching them on how to control something. They then take those skills and then they'll try to transfer them into other people. What does that mean? Perhaps as adolescents, they may start engaging in bullying, intimidations, or picking fights with people who are weaker than them. So that's a sign also. Now, if you look at the situation with Christopher Porco, all right, he was taking advantage of his parents' property. He was taking advantage of employers. He was falsifying records. So I would share with you is that when you see antisocial behaviors, at times maybe people outgrow them. That's very possible. But if you see a continuation of certain behaviors, they should not be ignored.
Why was law enforcement's interview strategy of Christopher Porco flawed?
In terms of, now, I want to take a moment to talk about, what happened in the Christopher Porco case, especially with the interview process. And this goes back to what I said in my introduction, and also when we talked about the psychological risk factors. And that is that when we don't understand the personality traits of an offender, that can impact on how we investigate a case, how we interview a case, and ultimately what happens legally in a prosecution. Let me explain. In this case, within hours after the homicide of Christopher Porco's father and the attempt on the mother, he came in for an interrogation. Now, I can't go into the entire interview of it. I've had an opportunity to go over the transcript. And in fact, this is a case that I use with my students and also when I lecture nationwide on red collar crime on how not to engage in an interview, especially with somebody who may be displaying psychopathic traits. Now, in this case, these were fine officers, fine detectives, but I do believe that they misinterpreted who they were dealing with. I believe that they were using an emotional framework, an emotional strategy to try to make Christopher feel bad about what he did. To see if in fact he would confess out of guilt, and that you would be so overwhelmed with your own guilt that you would just confess. But that's not what happened here. Okay? He didn't confess, and this was a long interview process. You had a situation in which also the law enforcement was getting frustrated with him. All right? But yet none of this seemed to matter to Christopher, because he went to that interview to also find out what they knew about the homicide. So it was going in both directions. Why is this important? Well, what happened eventually is that they tried to use ways to try to make him feel bad, but at one point he just basically then started asking for an attorney. Why is that important? Well, under our legal system, when one asks for an attorney under Miranda, and they're called Miranda rights, and perhaps many of you have seen this on TV, questioning must cease. It has to stop. In this case, it didn't stop, and the officers kept asking him questions. And what is unfortunate is that when they were not using an aggressive tone with him, he actually revealed many things that could have come in at trial. He talked about himself at times lying, okay? Or that he would talk about that he came from a wealthy family, but he didn't. He didn't come from a poor family, but he didn't come from something that we would characterize as from the elite, all right? But that was never able to be used. Why is this important? Because the law enforcement violated his rights, the statements and anything they said could not be used at trial in what is referred to as in their case in chief, meaning for them to go forward. Why is that a problem? Well, because the jury was never able to see what Christopher behaved like during this interview. Well, you can say, well, why is that important? Well, consider you get a phone call from detectives saying that your parents, one parent or both parents, have been murdered. How would you react? I think you'd be devastated. What happened here? He couldn't wait to go to the interview. In fact, he questions what took the detectives so long to get in touch with him. That should have been a red flag, okay? So the jury was never able to see those qualities that speak volumes.
So what are the consequences of a flawed interview strategy?
When you have that flawed interview strategy, as we have seen, what happens is that when you don't assess the person properly, that means that you may assess your strategy in a flawed manner, and if it's in a flawed manner, it can end up with more of a compromised prosecution.
Is there a better solution in training law enforcement to know what to look out for?
That is a fantastic question in terms of training law enforcement. In fact, when I lecture, and I actually lecture to homicide detectives, we actually go through this case study on what not to do. This is what I would share because it can be a detailed explanation. First of all, if anybody is going to come across people who are probably psychopathic offenders, it's going to be law enforcement, all right? What happens at times is that if you're successful in getting confessions, you may use that same strategy over and over until, guess what? That strategy doesn't work anymore. So what am I getting at? Before you go down a certain path, try to assess where this person is at psychologically if you can. This is not to say that you're making an assessment that the person is psychopathic. The question is, are these people displaying psychopathic traits? Number one, this person, Christopher, for example, was not showing any emotions about the death of his parents. And in fact, you get to the point where he's playing legal games with law enforcement, all right? That should have been a red flag. Now you can say, well, why is that important? This is the reason. That if the psychopathic offender gets the sense that you're playing bluff with them, okay, typically you're not going to win that battle because they're going to see through what you're trying to do, all right? What happened here in the Christopher Porco case? When they did it in a non-emotional way, but just very objective, he gave incriminating evidence. And it wasn't just what he said, it's what he didn't say. Furthermore, When you catch somebody like them in a lie, especially in a red collar crime case, think about the implications. Even before you address homicidal facts, you already have that person lying about their fraudulent behavior. That is devastating. That how are you going to believe somebody about the innocence about their murder when they can't even come clean about their fraud that they committed? So that's why, number one, law enforcement has to be trained in understanding red collar crime. They also have to understand, if possible, a little bit about white collar crime. Why is that important? Because white collar crime has an intangible quality about it. You don't necessarily see the fraud. For example, if I show you a murder weapon, a knife, a gun, a hammer, an axe, it's tangible. You can see it, you can feel it, you can touch it. But when it comes to fraud, it's behind the scenes. An investigator who is savvy may want to first ask them, are there any financial issues that we need to be aware of? Did you engage in any fraud that we need to be aware of? Well, either if they say yes, you may have now a motive that is fraud, detection, homicide. And if they say no, and you find out that there was fraud that predated the homicide, you caught them in a lie, which then can be used at trial. So understanding that training element is incredibly important.
Why was law enforcement's interview strategy of James Suarez successful?
The one with James Suarez, in my opinion, was a phenomenal success. And let me explain. This is a situation in which he killed both of his parents. And then, if my memory serves me correctly, either he stuffed their bodies in a cesspool or he buried them near a cesspool. Now, what did the detectives do here? They were non-threatening to James, so that James never asked for an attorney in this case. And James said, sure, I'll help you. So what did they do? They kept going back and forth to James. And what happened here? He told so many inconsistencies about what happened to his parents that the fact that he did not confess at that moment was irrelevant. All of those lies were what I would characterize as death by 1,000 cuts. You get to the point where that individual lost credibility. And that's a wonderful example of how you approach somebody, a red collar criminal, in a non-threatening manner so that you get the information that you want.
Thanks, Frank.